I see on the front seat badge form, we've got final glide. I'd taken final glide out of this because I didn't want the talk to be too long. I do have a couple of slides at the end of it, and if we're going okay, I might get onto that. What I really want to do is talk about the basics behind Speak to Fly. Now, these days, we've pretty much got an app for everything. And one of the dangers is that people decide not to bother about understanding what the app does. I think this is really dangerous in flying. I think the Boeing 737 MAX issue has components of this. So I'm going to make an effort to convey to you the basic concepts involved in Speak to Fly. I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you. Back in the beginning of flying, they were just happy to get airborne, even if it was only for a few seconds. The only lift they knew about in the early days was hill lift. And for that reason, many gliding clubs, like this one, where I learned to fly, that's where the club is, built at the top of a big long ridge. It was 8 miles long. And really, in the early days of gliding, duration was the thing that counted. If you read some of the history, you know, guys did 15 minutes, and that was just wonderful, and then 20, and then an hour, then several hours. And what was important was that the glider shouldn't come down too quickly. That's how you managed. That's how you managed to keep these flights sustaining. Launching was very often by bungee. It's an English T-21 about to be bungeed off that ridge. They did use winches, but on the hillsides, when you could catapult into hill lift, this is by far the cheapest and funnest way to do it. And there he is. The 6 or 8 people have run down the hill, they stretch the bungee cord, and then they let go of the glider, and up it goes into the lift. It is the most wonderful way to take off. As I said, minimum sink was really a design goal in the early days of gliders. And look at the size of those wings. This is about a 16.5 meter glider, and the cord is nearly 7 feet. Massive compared with what we're used to today. So minimum sink. I want you to remember that because I'm going to be picking on some of you guys soon. Retrieves usually were necessary when the wind stopped. And what they lacked in distance, they sure made up for the number of people required. Here we got 10 people involved. They had to pull the glider up to that tree and then de-rig it and take it over the fence. Finally put it in the trailer. Sometimes they didn't even need a trailer. This guy landed out on the ridge. All they needed to do was lift it over the fence and drag it back to the club. Tom Colson is our resident expert on that sort of retrieve. You can ask him about it sometime.
Shortest land up.
Other times, it was really important that the retrieve crew got there quickly, before the tide. Yeah, back in those days, there was little incentive for people to go on a retrieve. They certainly didn't have the state dinner in agreement then, but the main thing was you could get out of hangar stacking, which, as you see, was a little bit more involved than what we are used to. That was all well and good. Gliding was fun. It was a local affair. And then they discovered thermals. And this changed things immensely. Suddenly, Distance was the name of the game. The designers started to get very keen on L/D, and the flights were generally downwind, and the pilots would get as far away from the club as possible. They went for gliders with long, slender wings. Oh, sorry, they discovered thermals. Maximum L/D was really the design goal. They didn't mind too much at what speed the maximum L/D occurred, because after all, they were going with the wind. And they had gliders like this, long, slender wings, still fairly light, and with a gull wing. I believe there was no known aerodynamic advantage in the gull wing, but it sure as hell helped sell the gliders. They also took field manager duty very seriously in those days. The girl on the right with the pistol was the field manager that day, and she was saying to the two pilots, "This will be the last time I speak to you about smoking near the gliders." The guy that survived later became a member of SOSA. Maximum cross-country. Oh, I'm jumping a bit. After that, sorry, we'll go back to the previous one. As gliders got better and the pilots got better, the distances got longer and the retrieves got more and more onerous. Sometimes the crews would spend half the night looking for their pilot who was sleeping comfortably in a haystack or something like that. And there was muttering amongst the crews, even talk of mutiny. So somebody came up with the bright idea, well, let's all fly to Goa. And originally the idea was that they'd all try and fly to the same place, or that the pilot would declare a goal, so at least his crew would know where to start looking for it. But still the distance was pretty great, so long as that was downwind. And then somebody came up with the bright idea, well, let's make the goal the place where we started from. And after he explained that there would be turn points in between, they started to get the idea, and eventually it caught on. This actually revolutionized gliding in many ways. To begin with, it created an entirely new species of gliding person, the official observer, the modern version which we heard about today. They were supposed to go to the turn points and spend all day looking up at the sky through binoculars and not talking to anybody. They were often mistaken for bird watchers, and well-meaning members of the public would suggest they look at a tree or a bush, or engage them on a learned discussion about the lesser spotted baleen thrush. It was a tough job. Second thing was that it completely reversed the pecking order amongst the crews. Up to that time, the crews with the top pilots had all the bragging rights because their pilots got furthest. Now, with the goal back where they started from, it was the second and third-rate pilots whose crews had all the good story. Another point was that the crews, particularly the top pilots, found that they were being neglected by their pilots because the pilots were spending all their time and money whining and dining the official observers just to make sure they'd been seen at the turn points. And finally, and what matters to us, it changed the whole thing into a race. And that's why maximum cross-country speed became important, and that's what the designers had to figure out. And I think they had to fire their old minimum sink designers and hire a bunch of guys who could solve differential equations. So that's a little bit of history. Minimum sink, maximum L/D, and then maximum cross-country speed. Now this is where I'm going to start picking on people. Sergio, come out here. Please. Yeah, I'm going to try and pick on you all. This is a chart of airspeed in knots and vertical speed in knots. I want you to put a dot where you think minimum sink is. you fly the junior, to try and guess it back. It doesn't really matter. Put a dot. Okay. Any comments? Yes.
Slightly left.
Ruben.
Push it slightly left.
Yeah, come on.
For junior.
You've got the junior minimum sink at about 65 knots. Do you want to try again?
He thought those were kilometers.
Thank you.
So I said kilometers?
No, he thought.
Oh, all right. Yeah. Okay. Thomas. Put another dot. The aircraft going a little bit faster. You can sit down. I want to pick on everybody. Where would the dot be for the aircraft going a little bit faster? Good. Henry. Dot flying a little bit slower than minimum sink. Vertical speed in knots. So you're flying a little bit slower than minimum sink. Now what's wrong with that? You've got less sink than that's minimum sink. Let's try again. You see what he's done? The first one was minimum sink. That's when the aircraft is going down at the slowest it will. Now I'm asking him to do one dot closer to the stall.
What you're sinking, drags increasing, and you're looking.
Please come out and help him. Yep. Something a little bit slower. No, draw the dot. Oliver, come out and draw where the stall would be. Where do you think the stall would be? Yes, that's the stall. Yep. Good.
Yeah, must be. Good.
Will, do a point a good deal faster. The aircraft's flying a good deal faster.
I'm sorry?
Come and put a point where the aircraft is flying a good deal faster. Yeah, it's flying faster than this, a good deal faster. Okay. Emerson, a point where it's flying really fast. Imagine it's flying really fast. Yeah, put it where you think it should be. Okay, who wants the easy one? Ruben. This is easy. Join the dots. Right. That is the polar. That is the polar curve. For any one aircraft in a particular wing loading, this is a trace of the vertical speed plotted against the horizontal speed. Now, Mike, or Reza, I should be calling you. Can you figure out, using this wonderful high-tech ruler, pivoted there, where maximum LL of D is? And you see that the maximum L over D here is where you get the biggest bang for your buck as far as turning height into distance is concerned. If you fly slower here, you're going down, you're not going as far. If you fly faster, again, you're not going to. So that is the maximum L over D for that particular polar.
On a still air. So no
Yes,
wind.
yes, it's still air. Well, it's actually the glider flight related to the air that it's going through. But yeah, that's a good point. So, any questions so far? Now, this is the junior polar. Approximately. I took some time to work it out from the polar curves in the manual, and it is what I describe as a real polar as opposed to the salesman's polar. It's something that you can use for planning, considering your cross-country flights. And with this, we can show a number of things. Who haven't I picked on yet? Ty. Hank. This polar, imagine it is a description of what the glider is doing relative to the air it's flying through. This axis, for right now, represents the ground. So here, we've got the maximum L over D, and you can see that little white dot, which is approximately where it is, which is roughly what the pilot operating handbook shows. Now, if you're flying into headwind, what is the wind doing in relation to where you want it to go?
Reducing your ground speed.
It's what?
Reducing your ground speed.
Yes, and it's doing that because it's pushing you backwards. So, if we've got a 10-knot headwind, you show where the L over D is. And actually, two things have happened. It doesn't show very clearly with that. So, I'll move it, keep it there, to a 20-knot headwind. And the two things that have happened. Anybody like to name them?
For your best lift over drag, your airspeed has to increase.
Well, it has. But the two things are, number one, your glide angle is steeper. As I slide it back, watch what happens to that end of it. See the effect? Well, this is the effect of a headwind. And the second thing is that in order to get the best L over D, your airspeed has to increase. Likewise, if you've got a tailwind, yeah, what happens? Yeah, it's a bit difficult to do that. You see what's happening? What's happening to your airspeed? The best L over D, what happens to your airspeed with the tailwind? Yeah, but because the radius of this part of the curve is quite small, it's quite a tight curve, the speed decrease is minimal. You don't have to reduce it very much, half a knot, with a fairly sizable tailwind, to be able to be getting best L over D. So that's the effect of headwind and tailwind. Now, what do you think happens if you're flying through sink? Can you sink with no headwind or tailwind? Good. Same thing. Your best L over D occurs at a higher airspeed, but it's still not as good as the still air L over D. And likewise with lift, well, it's a little bit harder to... Obviously, if you get lift that's equal to your minimum sink, you won't be coming down at all. So, okay, thanks. Yeah, I think that's it. So, I tried to illustrate those three things. And here's some words of wisdom from Derek Piggott. He's now passed on. It's very true. For optimum speed for penetration, and by the way, I've simply been talking about penetration so far, not maximum cross-country speed. Can be found from the polar, but for practical purposes, it is good enough to fly at the best glide angle, speed plus 1/3 of the wind speed, and to increase speed still further at sinking air. Remember that. That's a good practical piece of advice. Yeah, Henry.
Is that headwind or tailwind?
So what?
Headwind or tailwind?
He means headwind. Yeah. The penetration question actually only comes in to your cross-country flying when you start thinking about the final glide. The flying, maximizing your cross-country speed actually is quite a different problem. Yeah, just what I've said now. Optimizing cross-country speed is a completely different problem. Optimizing cross-country speed for our purposes, and I'm talking to people who haven't yet done their first cross-country flight. So there's a lot of fine science and more sophisticated things about optimizing cross-country speed, but for our purposes, just based on climbing and gliding, we simplify it to minimizing the time between the top of one thermal and the next one. Like this. So I'm talking about the time from this moment, when the guy leaves that thermal on his glide up to here. And if we can minimize that, then we're optimizing the cross-country speed. Now, it has two components, at least two components. There's the time in the cruise, and there's a climb time. You can imagine that if you're flying too fast on the cruise, your L over D will be steeper, as I showed, and you'll get to the thermal lower down. So you'll have to spend more time climbing it. If you fly just at maximum L over D still air, you'll probably reach the thermal halfway up it. But the guy who flew at the correct speed will have got there way before you and will already have climbed above you by the time the L over D guy, still air L over D guy joins it. So there's an optimum speed. And we can determine this graphically from the polar. Here, still L over D. I can't prove this, but you can read it up on all the literature on the polars. If you've got, let's say, a 2-knot achieved rate of climb, and I'll define that term in a minute, a 2-knot achieved rate of climb, then if you do this on the polar, it'll give you the best speed to fly, which in this case is about 50 knots, and this is your cross-country speed. be illustrated. Here's the junior polar. And if we've got an achieved rate of climb of 2 knots in the thermal, then that tangent line gives you the speed to fly, that is your cruise speed, and it also, this distance gives you your actual cross-country speed, that is taking into account cruising and climbing. And again you can see this is tangent to this curve. Flying faster or slower, if I'm pivoting this route around here, both mean that the actual cross-country speed gets less. So it's like the maximum LOD case, except now this is taking into account lift. The trick is to determine your achieved rate of climb. Now, that's a term I use because if you look at the 2 components of time, I drew it very simply, the cruise and the climb. But for most of us, there's searching time, there's centering time, and then many of us milk the thermal at the top. That is, we climb to the top and we just hang around there, hardly going up at all. Very little lift. We call that milking the thermal. All of that time has to be booked against your climb time. As I say, it's not quite so easy to figure out the achieved rate of climb. So this is an illustration of what is likely to happen. Starts down here the cruise, starts looking for thermal. Oh, he's sniffed one, then he's got to go around and find it, then he's got to center it, then he climbs it, and then he milks it. So you're looking at the time for climbing is from here, when he actually stops going towards his goal, to here, when he starts again. So it is a big mistake, once you've centered the thermal, and you glance at your vario and it says it's 2 knots. Big mistake to use that as your achieved rate of climb for the McCready setting. And the McCready setting, as you probably know, is a handy way of getting this relationship between lift and speed to fly. But it's easy to be far too pessimistic, and you will hear a lot of pilots saying, oh, McCready doesn't really count, the theory isn't valid. Well, with really top pilots, like ourselves and members of Flown of the World, that may be true. But for most of us, as far as I can see, it's absolutely valid. The key thing is to come up with a realistic achieved rate of climb. So, the achieved rate of climb is the height you gain from there to there, divided by all this time, mucking about at the bottom, centering, and then milking. And it can be as low as 50% of what you see on your averager, or the vario, when you're in the thermal. So they're the components. And that's not all of it. Because what we want to put into our McCready setting, into our speed to fly, is the achieved rate of climb that we expect from the next thermal. Now, sorry, got the wrong button here. Take a situation like this. Here's a guy, let's say his real achieved rate of climb is 2.5 knots. He timed it. He sets up here. Andre, what do you think would be a reasonable thing, if it looks the same ahead of him, what would be a reasonable thing to assume for his next achieved rate of climb?
Well, the same, 2.5.
The same, yeah. What about here, James?
I think it's going to take longer, sorry.
get to the next height, right? So if you have a lower G.
Good, exactly. And likewise here. Now he's actually probably getting down below his active band. If he survives at all, there'll probably be a lot of search time. So the estimated achieved rate of climb decreases as your altitude decreases. Makes sense. But you have to sort of be aware of this so you don't just fly at your cruise speed straight into the ground because you hadn't realized that the conditions were changing. And so these are the things that should go into your achieved rate of climb.
Is there any relation between the rate of climb and the amount of sink you get?
There is.
Because whatever's got to go up
Yeah.
has got to come down, right?
There is, from the point of view of what goes up must come down. And actually, when you're cruising in so-called still air, it is likely coming down a little bit if there's good lift. Jorg would be a much better person to tell you how that might affect the cross-country flight, but that's a good point, yeah.
Chris, does that mean, sorry, on your previous slide, does that mean, practically speaking, it's not a straight line, that's more theoretical? In reality, you're probably more likely to fly a curve that shallows out as you get lower, as you lose altitude.
Yeah, I don't know whether you heard that point, but Chris is exactly right. As you're in a glide and you start to lose confidence, you're going to get that 2.5 knot thermal. You would naturally reduce speed, and provided you're still above maximum L over D, it wouldn't quite be that straight line into the ground. It would be curving up a bit. I don't know how much I could show that on that diagram, but yeah, you're right. So, to summarize, I was going to explain the term achieved rate of climb. There's something called thermal average that the instrument makers talk about, which is nearly the same thing. And if I understand it correctly, and Jorg, please correct me if I'm wrong, it senses when you turn and are no longer traveling on course, or it senses when you start turning. If you're searching around like that slide I illustrated, it might get all confused. It might think you're thermaling and start the time then. So achieved rate of climb includes all of those components. And I don't think it's the same as thermal average, but what I really want you to appreciate is all of those components go into your estimation of the rate of climb for the next thermal. It's a really good exercise to download your IGC file, even for local soaring, because there you can actually see, with both the map view and the barograph view, you can see when you stopped the gliding to the next thermal and started searching. Obviously, you have to do it when you find your own thermal. You're just cheating, you're kidding yourself if you do it and there's anybody else marking the thermal, because when you're on cross country, you've got to find your own thermal. Yes, Richard?
The question is, all flight computer do their calculation based on that prediction of McReady rate? Yes?
It will have all the logic that goes into the McReady logic.
And as usual, it will change based on the decreasing altitude. So the pilot should keep updating the McReady setting in the flight computer. Is that the routine?
I wouldn't advise that. As he gets close to the ground, the last thing you want him to do is be playing around with the instruments. He should be looking for lift and looking at field. So that is highly unadvisable.
You don't have to fly the speed that it's. You don't have to fly the speed that it's telling you to fly. You just fly slower.
Eventually you change, you're right.
Yeah, but that
Oh, but we are not keep playing with the
no,
devices.
this is what I was trying to say at the beginning. I want you to understand inwardly, have a picture of these concepts, because it's very easy to go wrong if you rely on the XC-SAW or anything. And also, if you're looking in the cockpit and looking at the damn thing instead of looking out, you could be a hazard to others. That's why I want you to understand these by these crazy models, etc. Yes?
So just to understand that black graph you had, when there's like a headwind, you moved it to the left, and then the curve, like the angle increased or decreased. So the speed we're looking at is the one on the black graph, not on the white graph, that we should be flying, right?
Yeah, that's your airspeed. The one on this thing, where the ruler touches here is your airspeed.
Well, the number at the bottom, right?
Well, that's the same.
Yeah.
But if the air is moving back, that's still your airspeed, but your speed over the ground will obviously be less.
Okay, but the speed at which you fly at increases because like the curve
Yes.
goes over the hump a bit more.
Yeah, yeah. If you look at the way the ruler rolls, as it were, this is still air, max L over D, and as the wind increases, your glide angle steepens for best L over D, or best penetration, and your airspeed has to increase too. Does that answer your question?
It's usually like between, well, let's say in this case, it's usually between like 40 and 50. So
I've got a handout with a bunch of these numbers, and I'm hoping that you guys will play with it, just to get a feel for these quantities, because it's important you have it in your imagination, in your mind, not looking at any instruments. One thing I forgot to mention is the effect of wing loading. Now in the Junior that doesn't carry water, it's really reflects the weight of the pilot. But increasing the wing loading has the effect of sliding this polar down the max L over D tangent. So with higher wing loading, your airspeed increases slightly, because the polar is moved that way. Your minimum sink increases, and your stall speed, which is here, increases. That's the effect of wing loading. That's why in the old minimum sink days, they were designing for a polar more like that. Of course, it would go down steeper because these things were really draggy. But they were interested in just staying airborne. Okay. These sheets are really for the pilots who haven't gone cross country. There's 15 of them. Well, they're being handed out. I'll explain the bottom part. The top part has some useful conversion factors. The next part has some approximations for glide. And then the bottom part is this. This shows the penetration, the effect of penetration I've tried to show on this whiteboard here. And this 0 represents the zero wind condition. So, if you're flying at 41 knots, which is, you've got a L over D through the air of 33.6, and I've just rounded to, your L over D is 33. If you're flying into a 5-knot headwind, it goes down to 29, 25 with 10 knot, etc. Tailwind on the other hand, it goes up to 37, 41. So let's take the case where the cheap rate of climb is 1.5 knots. That means that you're flying through the air on cruise at 50 knots. This is for the Junior. If you're flying into a headwind, your L over D VD over the ground, your penetration is down to 27, and likewise, the tailwind, 5 knot, goes up to 34. This is useful to know because when you come to the final glide, and I've got to skip ahead a bit here, as I mentioned, I chopped this back not to include final glide, even though it's right on the curriculum there. It is really useful to have an idea of what your final glide over the ground is. Also on the handout sheet is a polar. I've tried to create it as best I can for the junior for average wing loading. Don't take it as completely accurate, but it's something you can cut out and play with, and that's what I want you to do, so you actually see the relationships. That was the end, but we'll go on to final glide, if that's okay, Rob. We'll get back to Jorg's rule, and get back to final glide. Let's take the case of the 1.5 achieved rate of climb, flying at 50 knots into a 5 knot headwind. Remember that the L over D over the ground is 27. I think it shows it on that sheet. What that means is that this line, of course it's exaggerated here, is 1 over 27. And when you're planning your flight, when you're planning your final glide, you've got to realize that you should make it back over the club at 1,000 feet. So you've got to imagine a point projected out there, in this case if you've got a headwind of 27 to 1. So when you're flying your cross country here in Thurling, you keep going, flying at your designated cross country speed until you hit that line. And then you can start your final glide. But you don't just suddenly aim it at the club and forget about flying. You still have to take into account whether you're flying through sink or lift, and you should vary your speed accordingly. But remember that every time you have control input, you're creating more drag because you're changing the configuration of the aircraft. So if you're on a slightly dodgy final glide, you want to be quite gentle in your control movements. If there's a sudden upward surge, you've probably flown through it before, it's worth reducing your speed. But if you're flying somewhere and you see birds circling and you suspect they're thermal, then as soon as you start to feel it, just gradually reduce the speed a little bit to spend more time on the rising air. Likewise, if you feel it sinking, you'll increase speed a little bit more. But it is important to realize that you've got to come back to the club with plenty of height to land safely. If you're coming in from the north, remember that there are very few good fields between the club and 401. Remember about Reed's Field, you can go in there, and Puslinch. And there are 1 or 2 others, some of them really are not at all visible. Many years ago we had one of our aircraft cracked up because the guy got caught out and had to land in a field that was too short and he had to ground loop the aircraft. Another important thing, if you've been on a different frequency, super important to remember to change back to the SOSA frequency about 15 kilometers out. And then you listen. Try and figure out what's happening. Maybe they've changed the runway. And about 10 kilometers out, it's a good idea to announce your arrival. Charlie Alpha from the north, etc. If you're doing a final glide from the west, and it's the end of the day, be very careful about an east wind that'll spring up. What happens if this edge of the table is the western end of Lake Ontario, and it's a good soaring day, air rises here over the ground and sucks in cold air here. And what happens is that the lower you get down, you go into a headwind. Even if the basic flow is west, it can be this convective air, and it's cold, damp air, so it will cut off lift. And I've been caught out like that. I had to land near Branchton. My final glide computer said it was fine, but it didn't know there was an east wind. Something to be really aware of if you're coming back to Sousa from the west, even the southwest, although coming back from Tilstonburg, you'd hit that effect later. But coming back, for instance, from somewhere like Stratford, that could bring you down unexpectedly. One last thing to remember about final glide is it's super important to monitor it while you've still got time for an option. The lower you get, the less option you have about stopping them thermally. And it is quite easy to go on flying, believing you're going to make it beautifully, and if you're not monitoring, you're unaware you're in trouble until it's too late to do something about it. Really important. Okay, I think that's all I will say for now. Anybody got any questions? Do you want to talk about your 2-3-4 rule?
Sure. What I'll do is I'll bring up the thing from
Oh,
So,
Did you have a slide on this?
it's on mine.
Oh, it's in the deck. Okay.
So for your photos, that speed in knots. So if you look at 120 knots, I'm still. It's different configuration. It's
Oh,
18 versus 21.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
You can see, I mean, up until it was 90 knots, and it was hard to use. That's
oh,
so it's only after
Okay.
And yes, can you swap the microphone over for me?
There it is. So this is just going to take. Thank you. So this is just going to take a minute or two. People quite often ask me, with going through all the McCready settings and so, and they say, well, what McCready setting do you fly at, right? And I say, well, I follow Steve's 2-3-4 rule. Basically, if you look at what you set your McCready and what you find then as your thermal average or achieved climb rate,
Achieve rate of climb as well.
Yeah,
A-roll
okay.
is what I call it.
is always different. Like you said, you decide, I set my McCready to 3, and then you achieve 2 or so. And so you're never really optimum unless you exactly achieve what you set your McCready to. And there is a good in the Reichmann book, this comes out of the Reichmann book, there is an analysis of how big are your errors and how much are they costing you. And for our climate here in Ontario, I sort of looked through it, and there are sweet spots for McCready settings 2, 3, and 4. So if the day is pretty mediocre, just set it to 2. It means if you have to take a 1 knotter, you're not losing all that much. If you find a 4 knotter, the losses are still fairly minimum. And what's the chance of finding a 6 knotter on a mediocre day? If the day is pretty good, I set it to 3. So then that covers everything from 2 to, let's say, 5 knots with very small losses. And if it's really roaring, I set it to 4. That covers everything from, let's say, 2 to 3 knots to 8 knots with fairly small losses. There's a nice graph in the Reichmann book that actually, as a percentage, gives you the losses you will encounter Now, of course, when I fly in Namibia or in Nevada, it's a little different. So then I go higher. But for our weather here, 2, 3, 4, it's really all you need. So 2 slow, 3 okay, 4 fast. For strong conditions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's from somebody who can thermal pretty effectively, who can center pretty quickly, and doesn't milk it.
Yeah, never milk it. Circling is for the birds, keep that in mind. And we had this interesting discussion with Chris and I about what's the achieved rate of climb and what's the thermal average. Chris said, well, you have to take all the, when you stop thermaling and you start searching, you have to take this into account. And I said, when you stop running and start searching, I only stop running when I'm in lift, otherwise I don't stop running. Right? Unless, of course, one is slow down and is in survival mode. But in regular, once you're still in your band, in your active band, there's no point in stopping unless you're in lift. Otherwise, you just keep going. As long as you're in your band. When you fall out of your band, then different rules apply. Okay. Thank you very much for coming out. There's a question back there.
Yeah, on your 2, 3, 4 rule, seeing that for you, somebody more like my abilities, a lot less, would you recommend maybe taking that down like by half, like do 1.5, 2.5, and 2.5?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. What we want to avoid is flying with McCready 0, giving you best LOD, because then your losses in any climb, the losses are pretty significant, and you're not flying cross country if there's no lift, so obviously you're expecting something. So that's why I always keep it above 0. But yeah, if you want to be conservative, the point is basically stay conservative with your McCready setting. So even if you have 5 knots almost, don't set it to 5 knots, set it to 3. That's really the point.
For final glide as part of the bronze badge stuff, I just wanted to give people a quick preview. This is what we do as part of the morning briefing before we fly to Puslinch and back, where we calculate the glide ratio of the K21, we look at the polar of the K21, and we say how high do we have to be over SOSA to get to Puslinch with today's wind. And I think we were overly conservative last year with all of our calculations. I think everybody got to Puslinch with way too much height. That's because it was a much better day than we were expecting and the wind wasn't as strong as we were expecting. But this is an example of the final glide calculations that you get taken through on that day. And this document, as well as the answers that were put together on that day by the students, are all in the Slack channel. So everybody who's joining into the Bronze Badger Slack channel has access to that. But we calculate the glide ratio of the aircraft, subtracting for the headwind, doing all of that math and coming up with how high we have to be over the safari to get to Puslinch at circuit altitude. Anybody fly to Puslinch and remember how well these numbers worked out for them on their flights? Right?
Horrible.
Tell me more.
Going to Puslinch, it was just such a roaring day. The thermals were awesome. I was about 1,000 feet higher.
So did you thermal at all on the way?
I did the porpoising like you told us.
Right.
I actually got dropped off because I was like one of the first ones to go towards Puslinch.
Okay.
So I had to fly back to the field first.
Right.
And then go to Puslinch. And the thermals were just so awesome. Like,
So
doing
just
this.
porpoising, you ended up there much higher. How about the way
And,
back?
and on the way back, the winds were actually really good. nice tailwind coming back, and I was about 2,000 feet high. And I had to do timekeeper at 1 o'clock, so I'm like, we're gonna do a nice chin here.
So, if the objective was to give you confidence that these numbers are a safe minimum for you, was that achieved?
Very much so.
Okay.
Even my 50K, it was exactly like going to Piston. It was no different. The progression in the bronze badge program, it's so incremental that nothing's a big deal. If you're doing your 2-hour flights, you're going to Post Lynch, you can see it from your 2-hour flights. You know exactly where it is. You can just go there, and it's just like landing at Sosa. After you do your Post Lynch flight, going to York is where I did my 50K. I'm flying past Post Lynch. I can see Post Lynch. Well, once I'm getting to about the 401, now I can see York. So it's basically the exact same thing.
Okay. Thomas, has this given you the confidence to do your 50K in the next couple of months?
Yeah. Couple of months. Doing something about the weather?
Be optimistic. Be optimistic.
I'd just like to add something, if I may. What Greg was talking about is the happy end of the spectrum. I'd like you all to give some thought as to what it must be like when you're on a final glide and the lift is weak, if anywhere, and you're not sure whether you're going to make it. Just give that some thought, because that is the reality that I'm trying to talk to. If you're high and fast, well, big deal. But if you're low and it's marginal, then it can be horrible. And coming in from the north, where there's so few landing fields, it can be a killer. Give that some thought. I'm not trying to scare you off. I'm just saying there's a hell of a good reason to understand this. Maybe to plot out the numbers, the heights over the various geographic features like the 401 and the lakes and the 4-barn cluster just to the north of the club. What height you should be there to be making it back at 1,000 feet. Just give it some thought. You'll be a better pilot for it.
Should we have this calculation always in our mind and always update that based on the situation in the flight?
No.
Because it seems it's a little bit complicated things to do in our mind during the flight.
So before you take off, you're going to know approximately what the weather's going to be for the day, approximately where the wind's going to be coming from, and at what speed. You can rough out these calculations before you fly. And when we do these exercises on the ground, what we do is we get a compass and we draw some circles on the maps, on the charts. If they're not maps, they're charts. We draw some circles and we say, when we're going into the wind, each circle is 1,000 feet of height loss. So we know, yes, that's how far away we have to be from our goal. And when I'm going on a cross-country flight, I do the same thing, and I draw those same circles around each of the turn points that I'm going to go around. So for the wind direction, I know, yes, I can make that airport so long as I am 1,000 to 3,000 feet above circuit altitude as I'm approaching that turn point if it's a landable one. So that's part of the pre-flight on the ground. And when I'm in the air, I just ask myself, okay, my 10 kilometers per 1,000 feet of height loss that I had estimated on the ground, is that working out to be true? Or do I have to make it 9? Or do I have to make it 11? I'm just making a minor calculation, a minor estimation change to the outcome of the math, but I'm not redoing all of the math.
Another question is you just have glide ratio and wind into this calculation, but in reality we have different amount of seams.
Yes, this is for
which is
final
not reflected here.
Right, this is for final glide, so it assumes relatively still air on your final glide, or as much lift as you're finding sink in your porpoise.
So it is optimistic calculation.
Yeah. So
Everything's optimistic, you always have to revisit your decisions as you go.
So I did a number of those flights to Bush's last year, and they all suffered
on the optimistic side, if you like, from two things. One, the tow pilots often didn't take us above the field where we were supposed to. They took us up to on the safari. That gave us a 10-12% advantage already. So that's one reason we were high. Two, there was lots of lift along the way, so we weren't losing very much height as we went along. So that gave us another 10-12%, maybe 50% advantage on the optimistic side. I have had a Final Glide go badly from the 401 in, and really, by the time you're much just south of the 401, you got to know you can make it. Now, I had one that I was up near Fergus, and it was by chance that I got away with this one, because as I was climbing in this thermal, I'm looking at the guy above me saying, his glider isn't much worse than mine, why hasn't he left already? My computer says I can make it from here. This is 40K up. And I fussed around, and that time I had an old computer, you know, I had to put in a lot of hand-on stuff, and I had a handheld GPS to tell me the distance. So I rechecked all the numbers. Do I have my safety? Do I have this? Do I have it like that? And by the time I checked that, I gained another 200 meters above my safety. I said, well, the hell of it, I left. I crossed the 401 with my safety plus an extra 200 meters. And I went through sync all the way from the 401 all the way to Sosa. I lost the 200 meters. And I arrived at the field just at my safety. My safety was only 150 meters. If I hadn't had the 200 extra meters, I'd have been up that thing. And God knows what out there. You know, so it can go badly in a hurry.
So your point, both of you, it isn't just about the calculation. If you know you're coming in our case, from the north over the 401, you've got to be even more conservative, because you know there's
well, there's a set of road tracks up there just to the north of us. That's 10 kilometers out. At that point, it's a decision. Am I carrying on? Am I going to go to Bushman's Lake? I don't recommend Reedsville, Bushman's Lake. And you really have to make that decision at that point. If you're not absolutely confident you can go that extra 10, go to Bushman's.
What I would suggest, really in answer to your question, Mike, that now in the winter, you look at the three possibilities. Coming in from York, coming in from the west like Stratford, and coming in from the southwest from Tilsonburg. And for each case, make a list of the heights you should be above a certain geographic features, like the railway or the 401. For each route, make 3 lists. One for flying maximum LOD, one for something steeper, and one for something still steeper, 10 knot headwind, let's say. So that when you're flying and you start to get doubtful, you can say, well, I've got maybe a 5 knot headwind. I should be at this height over this feature. And if you do that, you can monitor it and see whether you're maintaining that glide angle or whether it's getting worse. And it will tell you when you're in trouble in time to do something about it. Bit of homework, but now is the perfect time of year to do that. And you can do it from that sheet again.